The 42nd floor had a different kind of quiet. Not the quiet of an empty building or a Sunday morning. This was the quiet of money, the kind that had been there long enough to stop announcing itself. The carpet didn't creak, the air tasted like recirculated calm. Even the light came down softer, as if it had been briefed on proper behavior before entering. Nolan Fitch had worked maintenance and facilities for the Hargrove Tower for 11 years. He had fixed burst pipes on the 14th floor at 2 in the morning. He had replaced ventilation units in the server room with a cold that made his knuckles ache for a week. He had once crawled through a ceiling duct on the 29th floor while a board meeting carried on below him, unaware that a man in dusty overalls was inching past their heads while they discussed shareholder returns. He was used to being invisible. That was, in a way, the job. But the 42nd floor was different. He had been up here exactly twice before today, both times for brief work orders that had been resolved in under 20 minutes, and both times he had left with the distinct impression that he had walked into a space that wasn't quite meant for him. Not out of cruelty, simply out of logic. Some rooms have a gravity that tells you where you belong. Today the work order had come through at 3:15 in the afternoon. Laptop malfunction, executive suite, 42nd floor. Priority request, name on the order, C. Hargrove. Nolan had stared at that name for a moment before picking up his kit bag. Catherine Hargrove was the CEO of Hargrove Capital Group. She was also the granddaughter of the man who had built the tower Nolan had spent 11 years keeping upright. Her picture was in the lobby, a formal portrait mounted near the elevator bank, beside the original Hargrove patriarch and his son. She was the third generation, the one who had taken the firm from real estate development into private equity and infrastructure investment, and who had, according to a magazine profile someone had left in the break room last spring, grown the company's assets under management by 400% in 12 years. Nolan had glanced at that profile once. He hadn't read it thoroughly. He had his own problems. He took the elevator to 42, knocked twice on the outer door of the executive suite and waited. A voice came from inside. Not the voice of an assistant. It's open. The suite was large and spare. No clutter. A long desk of pale ash wood positioned to face both the door and the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the harbor. Downtown spread below in the late afternoon light, the water going silver and gray in the distance, the CN Tower visible through the haze. Catherine Hargrove was standing at the window with her back to him when he entered. She was perhaps 50, though the word suggested a softness that didn't apply here. She was tall. Her jacket was the color of dark charcoal, and her hair, which was dark brown with threads of silver at the temples, was pinned back without ceremony. She turned when she heard his footstep. "You're from facilities," she said, not a question. "Yes, Nolan Fitch." He held up his kit bag slightly. "You put in a request about the laptop. It stopped loading my files about an hour ago." She gestured toward the desk. "I've restarted it twice. The same error message keeps appearing." He nodded and moved toward the desk. The laptop was a high-end model, slim and expensive-looking, sitting open beside a legal pad covered in handwriting. He didn't look at the notepad. He looked at the screen. The error was a system conflict, a corrupted cache folder that had locked access to a file directory. Common enough if you knew where to look. "Should take about 15 minutes, he said. "Fine." She returned to the window. He sat down in the chair she hadn't offered and began to work. There was a particular silence that settled when two people who don't know each other share a space and both understand that interaction isn't required. He had sat in that silence in hundreds of offices over 11 years. This one had a different weight to it. He navigated through the system folders, cleared the corrupted cache, ran a diagnostic. The laptop beeped softly twice. The directory began to reload. And then, as the file structure populated on the screen, a photograph opened automatically in the background. A large image that the system had been holding in a suspended preview window, waiting to restore itself once the cache cleared. Nolan saw it before he could look away. It was a personal photograph. A woman, younger than the one standing at the window, but unmistakably her, sitting on the edge of a dock somewhere, a lake. Northern Ontario trees behind her, the kind that go dark green and black in evening light. She was wearing a simple dress and her hair was loose, and she was laughing at something outside the frame, her head tipped back, her whole face open in a way that bore almost no resemblance to the woman standing 10 feet away from him. He closed the preview window immediately. His hand was steady. His expression didn't change, but he had seen it, and some small and involuntary part of his brain had registered. She looked different then, lighter, like someone who still believed in the particular kind of afternoon that ends with a fire and the smell of lake water in your clothes. He kept working. Behind him, he heard her shift position. "How long have you been with the building?" she asked. It wasn't warm, exactly, but it was the kind of question that indicated she was willing to acknowledge he was human. 11 years, he said. "Under my grandfather. The last 3 under your grandfather, the rest under your father, and then you." A pause. "You've been here longer than most of the people on this floor." "That's likely true." She said nothing more for a moment. He ran a second check on the directory structure, ensuring no other files had been corrupted in the lock. "Is it going to hold?" she asked from across the room. "Should do. The cache conflict is cleared. I'll note it in the system, so IT can run a full maintenance pass later this week. Sometimes this error is a one-time thing. Sometimes it's the start of a pattern." He paused. "Depends on what's asking too much of the system." He heard her make a quiet sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He didn't turn around. The laptop finished its reload. All files appeared intact. He was about to close out the diagnostic tool when he noticed something. A secondary folder on the desktop that had partially unpacked itself during the reload. A personal folder titled with a date rather than a name. Several image files, thumbnail previews visible. He moved the mouse to close it without looking, the way a person looks away from something that isn't theirs. He wasn't entirely fast enough. One image had expanded itself to a larger preview, the system's auto-display function triggering before he could close the folder. It was another photograph from the same dock, the same lake, but this one was a portrait shot, deliberate. She was looking directly at the camera. She was perhaps 40 in the photo or just under. No jacket, no pin in her hair. She looked, and this was the word his brain supplied before he could choose otherwise, radiant. Not beautiful in the way of an edited image, but beautiful in the way of someone who was, at the exact moment the photograph was taken, genuinely and completely happy. He closed the folder. He closed the preview. He ran the final diagnostic check and prepared to pack up his kit bag. "Done," he said. He stood from the chair and turned around. She was still at the window, but she had turned to face the room at some point during the last few minutes. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite categorize. Not hostile, not warm. Something in between, or perhaps something that existed outside that particular spectrum. "Thank you," she said. He picked up his kit bag. He was nearly at the door. "The file system auto-restored a preview," she said. Her voice was even. "I saw you close it." He stopped. He turned back. "Yes," he said simply. She studied him for a moment. He didn't look away, but he didn't offer anything further. "That was taken at my family's property," she said. "Near Halliburton. A long time ago." "I understand." He meant it not as platitude but as information, that he understood what she was telling him, that he had registered the boundary and would not cross it, that whatever he had seen would go no further than this room. She seemed to understand what he meant because something in her posture shifted. Not much, just slightly, the way a door opens a fraction rather than all the way. It was a different time, she said. Not to him, really. More to the window or to the harbor visible beyond it. He should have left. His job was done. The laptop was repaired, the error resolved, the work order complete. He had 17 other open items on his list for the day. He said without planning to, "I can see that." She looked at him then, directly, in the way people rarely look at maintenance staff, as though she was deciding something. "Can you?" she said. And then, after a pause that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the room, "Was she pretty?" "The woman in that photograph." The question arrived without warning and rearranged the air in the room. Nolan didn't answer immediately. He was 61 years old. He had been married for 19 years and widowed for 7. He had raised a daughter, mostly alone, who was now grown and living in Calgary, and who called him every Sunday evening because she still worried about him more than he worried about himself. He had spent 11 years in a building full of powerful people and had learned over time that power and certainty were rarely the same thing. He knew what the question really was. Not vanity, not a test. Something more worn down than either of those. A question from someone who had looked at a photograph of herself from another era and was no longer sure the woman in it was recognizable. Not in the mirror. Somewhere deeper than that. "The woman in that photograph," he said carefully, Looked like someone who knew exactly how to spend a summer evening. He paused. That's a kind of pretty that doesn't photograph well, mostly. But it did in that one. Catherine Hargrove was quiet for a long moment. That's a strange answer, she said at last. You asked a strange question. Another silence. Outside, a cloud passed over the afternoon light and the harbor went momentarily darker. My husband took that photograph, she said. My ex-husband. She said it in the same tone she might have said the square footage of an office property, but her eyes went somewhere else. He said he took it because I looked like myself. He said I had a habit of not looking like myself. Nolan said nothing. He understood that some things aren't said to receive a response. They're said because they've been held too long. I haven't been back to Halliburton in 6 years, she said. That's a long time. Yes. She turned back to the window. The work order is complete, Mr. Fitch. Thank you for your time. He recognized the signal. He nodded once and left. In the elevator going down, he leaned against the back wall and let out a long, slow breath. He was a man who had spent a decade and more being invisible in this building, and something about the last half hour felt like the opposite of that. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way he could have explained easily, but in the way of something noticed, like a light coming on in a room that had been dark long enough that you'd almost stopped registering it as dark. He put it away. He had a work order for a clogged drain on the 27th floor. He was already 20 minutes late. The building was 42 floors. He was on the 2nd floor when his radio crackled and the facilities coordinator asked if he was available for an emergency on 38. He was. He was always available. That was, after all, the job. 3 weeks passed. Nolan Fitch did not think about Catherine Hargrove every day during those 3 weeks. He thought about the clogged drain on 27. He thought about the ventilation unit on the 9th floor that was behaving strangely and would likely need to be replaced before winter hit properly. He thought about his daughter Abby calling on Sunday and asking whether he was eating properly, which he was, mostly. He thought about the small apartment in Leslieville, where he had lived for 9 years, which was quiet in a way that had once felt like relief, and now sometimes felt like its own kind of weight. He thought about her twice, once when he passed the lobby portrait on a Tuesday morning, and noticed, for the first time, that the formal photograph didn't capture the way her face had shifted when she'd spoken about Halliburton. He wasn't sure any formal photograph could. Once on a Thursday evening, riding the elevator back down after a late repair, when the car passed 42 without stopping and he had a brief involuntary thought, not romantic or not entirely, about what it must be like to be the woman in the portrait, and whether she was, at that particular moment, looking out those big windows alone. He put both thoughts away efficiently, with the practice of a man who had long since learned which thoughts were worth keeping and which were the kind that could turn a good day into a strange one if you let them run. The second work order came on a Friday, same floor, same name on the form this time, boardroom screen malfunction, meeting scheduled for Monday morning, urgent. He took the elevator to 42. The boardroom was adjacent to the executive suite. The door to the suite was open, and as he passed it to reach the boardroom, he saw her inside, at the long desk, not standing at the window this time, but seated, reading something from a printed document. She was in a different jacket today, slate blue. Her reading glasses were on, which for some reason struck him as more human than anything else he had seen on this floor. She looked up when she heard his footstep. "Mr. Fitch," she said, and then, after the briefest of pauses, "I expected someone from it sent it to facilities. The screen is a hardware issue, not software." She removed her reading glasses. "I see," he continued to the boardroom. He found the problem quickly, a connection issue at the wall panel, a cable that had worked itself loose. He reseated the connection, powered up the screen, tested the input sources. Everything ran correctly. He was on his way back out when he heard her voice from the suite. "Mr. Fitch." He stopped in the corridor between the two rooms. "Yes?" She appeared in the doorway to the suite. She wasn't holding anything. She had put the reading glasses away. She looked at him with the same direct, assessing quality as before, as if she was trying to reconcile what she was about to say with some prior version of herself that would not have said it. "Would you like a coffee?" she asked. He considered this. "I'm on the clock. I know," she said. 20 minutes. "I have a meeting later as well." He left his kit bag in the corridor and followed her into the suite. There was a small credenza along one wall with a coffee machine that cost more than some of the equipment he serviced. She poured 2 cups without asking how he took his, then set a small container of cream beside his and left him to determine the rest. He took it black. He left the cream where it was. They stood at the window, not beside each other, exactly, but near enough that the silence was deliberate rather than accidental. "I owe you an explanation," she said, looking at the city below. "About what I asked you 3 weeks ago. You don't, I think I do." She held her cup with both hands. It wasn't a normal thing to say to a maintenance worker who had just fixed your laptop. I've heard stranger things in 20 years of going into rooms where people didn't expect to be interrupted. A pause. "That's a diplomatic answer. It's a true one." She turned slightly toward him. "I had been looking at those photographs for about an hour before the system locked up. I hadn't looked at them in 2 years. My assistant found the folder during a file reorganization and asked me what to do with it." A brief pause. "I told her to leave it, and then I opened it." She said nothing more for a moment. "The man who took those photographs," she said, "believed that I had forgotten how to be anything other than a function. His word, not mine. He said I had stopped being a person and become a position." She kept her eyes on the harbor. "I told him he was wrong. We divorced 2 years later." Nolan held his coffee. He didn't rush her and he didn't deflect. He had learned in a long life of listening that people generally know when they want a response and when they need the space to finish speaking. "I look at those photographs," she said, "and I try to remember what that afternoon felt like. Not what I was thinking about, not what I was planning for the following week, what the light felt like on my arms, whether the dock was warm." She paused. "I can't remember." "That's not unusual," he said. "After enough time, how much time does it take?" He thought about that honestly. Different for everyone. Sometimes the feeling comes back from somewhere else, not from the memory directly. From something that reminds you of the kind of person you were in that memory. She looked at him then, the same direct look as before, but with something added to it that he couldn't quite name. Recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of it. "How do you know that?" she asked. "My wife died 7 years ago," he said, simply, without the weight people sometimes put on those words as warning or signal, just information. "We used to go up to Georgian Bay every September. I spent a long time not being able to feel what that felt like. The first time I could feel it again was when my daughter made the same breakfast my wife used to make. Eggs, canned tomatoes, too much pepper, and I was standing in her kitchen and I wasn't thinking about September at all." Catherine Hargrove was quiet. She looked back at the window. "I'm sorry," she said. "About your wife, thank you." He drank his coffee. "It gets easier. That's not a consolation, it's just what happens." Outside, the city moved. Traffic 42 floors below the waterfront park where people were walking despite the cold. A freighter on the lake going slowly toward the Western Gap. "The property near Halliburton," she said after a while. "My grandfather built the cottage. My father extended it. I grew up spending every August there. When my husband and I divorced, I couldn't decide who it belonged to more, so I stopped going." She paused. "That was 6 years ago. And the cottage, still there. My caretaker sends photographs every spring to confirm the roof survived winter." "A roof photograph," he said. "That's a strange way to know a place is still yours." She made the quiet sound again, the one that wasn't quite a laugh from 3 weeks ago. But it was warmer this time, like a window opened rather than a door cracked. "Yes," she said, "it is." His 20 minutes were up. He could feel it in the way the silence had shifted from open to naturally complete. "I should get back," he said. She nodded, set down her cup. "Thank you for the boardroom. It was a loose cable. You could have found it yourself." "I could have," she agreed. "I've just gotten out of the habit of looking for loose things." She paused, and he understood she wasn't talking about cables anymore. Perhaps that's something to reconsider. He picked up his kit bag in the corridor. The elevator arrived without him pressing the button twice, which he took as a small grace. On the way down, he thought about Georgian Bay in September. The particular smell of the trees going dry at the end of summer. The sound the water made against the dock. He could feel it now, quite clearly. He decided that was worth noting. There was no third work order, not in the formal sense. 3 weeks after the Friday coffee, Nolan arrived at his locker at 7:15 in the morning and found a sealed envelope with his name on it, written in handwriting that was precise and small. Inside was a card, plain, no printed message. The handwriting inside said, "The caretaker sent photographs of the Halliburton property this week. The roof held." I found myself thinking that photographs of a place aren't the same as the place. "I'm going up in 2 weeks." It seemed relevant to mention. CH. He read it twice. He turned it over. There was nothing on the back. He stood at his locker for longer than was strictly necessary, holding the card. He wasn't a man who read too much into things. He had lived long enough to know the difference between what was being said and what a person hoped was being said. And he had learned, at some cost, to let the distance between those two things sit quietly rather than trying to collapse it prematurely. But he also knew what it meant when someone who had stopped going somewhere decided to go back. He took a piece of notepaper from the shelf in his locker, the small pad he used for writing down work orders when the radio cut out, and wrote in his own handwriting, which was larger and less precise than hers, "Georgian Bay in September. First time back after 4 years. The breakfast helped. NF." He folded it and left it at the reception desk on the 42nd floor with her assistant, who looked briefly surprised and then professionally neutral, which he respected. He went back to work. He had a full list. The ventilation unit on 9 was getting worse. There was a water pressure irregularity developing on floors 13 through 15 that he'd been tracking for 2 weeks. The building was always, in some small way, coming undone, and it was his job to hold it together. He did it with the same unhurried care he had applied for 11 years, the same attention to things that had worked themselves loose, the same quiet presence in rooms that weren't designed for him, but had, over time, come to rely on him more than they would readily admit. On a Monday morning, 11 days later, he arrived at his locker to find a second envelope. Inside, the card said only, "The dock is still warm in October if you go early enough." He read it once. He put it in his jacket pocket against the left side of his chest, where it stayed for the rest of the day. Through a burst pipe on 7, a persistent alarm fault on 23, and a full hour in the ceiling of the 14th floor with a flashlight and a cable tester. At the end of his shift riding the elevator down for the last time, he passed the 42nd floor without stopping. But he looked at the numbers as they descended, and on 42 he thought about a dock in Halliburton in October, and the particular quality of morning light on still water, and a woman who had remembered after 6 years away that a place could still belong to her. Some things you don't need to say out loud. You just need to know they're true and let that be enough. And then, when the time comes, you pick up your coat and drive north and see what the light is doing.